Hello again, Jared Pitts here, and today we're going to be reading another article by Dr. Ray Peat. This one, as usual, can be found on his website, raypeat.com, and it's under the article section. This one's called Epilepsy and Progesterone. Before I get into the article, I just want to remind you that you can book a 15-minute free consultation with me at MissouriHealthCoach.com. My new website, MissouriHealthCoach.com. I also wanted to remind you that you can support the channel by using my links in the description of my videos, and those are for different companies like Health Natura. And if you use my link, then you'll get a certain percentage off, like 20%, and I will get a small percentage of that sale. And I only put links up there for companies whose products I use, and for supplements that Dr. Peat researched and shared with us about. For example, aspirin, vitamin K2, D3, and things like this. Okay, this is how it goes. The length of the lifespan and of the period of youth or immaturity is closely associated with the size of the brain, and the brain has a very high rate of metabolism. When something interferes with this very high metabolic rate, the consequences may be instantaneous, or developmental, or chronic and degenerative, or even transgenerational. The issue of epilepsy centers on questions of brain metabolism, and so it has all of those dimensions. As I discuss the mechanisms known to predispose a person to epilepsy, I will emphasize the centrality of oxidative energy production and show how quote-unquote stroke, stress, hyperactivity, dementia, and other brain syndromes are related to quote-unquote epilepsy. Similar processes are being studied in the heart and other tissues. Eventually, we might have a general language that will make it easier to understand the parallels in the various kinds of quote-unquote seizure in any organ. As an old term, quote-unquote epilepsy has acquired a burden of pseudo-scientific ideas, covering old superstitions with an overlay of new superstitions. Hereditary epilepsy has been discussed in countless textbooks and medical journals, but I think a much better case could be made for the inheritance of a tendency to offer stupid genetic explanations. Alright, looks like Dr. Peat is not going to pull any punches on this one, as usual. Quote-unquote hereditary epilepsy and quote-unquote idiopathic epilepsy are seriously pathogenic terms. Quote-unquote brain scar sometimes has a factual basis, but most often the term is an evasion of understanding. And if you don't already know, idiopathic just means we don't know where this is coming from, right? No explanation. So fancy word to say we don't have a word. We don't have an explanation for you. All right. As long as we realize that the essential meaning of the word is quote-unquote something that grabs you, quote-unquote epilepsy is a convenient way to refer to a cluster of convulsive states, fainting spells, night terrors and nightmares, and strange sensations. Seizures can be caused by lack of glucose, lack of oxygen, vitamin B6 deficiency, and magnesium deficiency. They are more likely to occur during the night, during puberty, premenstrually, during pregnancy, during the first year of life, and can be triggered by hyperventilation, running, strong emotions, or unusual sensory stimulation. Water retention and low sodium increase susceptibility to seizures. When I was in high school, our dog found and ate a pint of bacon grease, and shortly afterward had a convulsive seizure. I knew of veterinarians who treated seizures in dogs with a vermifuge, so it seemed obvious that a metabolic disturbance, especially if combined with intestinal irritation, could cause fits. And a vermifuge is just a medicine that expels parasitic worms. Thus why he's referencing intestinal irritation. It was undoubtedly such observations that led some physicians to advocate removal of the colon as treatment for epilepsy. Goodness gracious. Not surprising, but also, holy cow. Yeah, let's just remove the colon. Pregnancy and the menstrual cycle have been recognized as having something to do with seizures. But when seizures occurred only during pregnancy, they were classified as non-epileptic. And when they had a clear premenstrual occurrence, they were likely to be classified as quote-unquote hysterical fits, to be treated with punishment. It has been observed that all quote-unquote recognized anti-seizure drugs are teratogenic. Alright, and terato meaning like monstrous or monster or something. And so teratogenic meaning could cause deformations in a baby, in utero, that type of thing. And women who are taking such drugs are told that pregnancy might kill them if they stop the drug, but that their babies will have a greatly increased risk of birth defects if they take the drugs during pregnancy. This is why a better understanding of epilepsy is very important. Old therapies are mainly important for the insight they can give into the nature of the physiological problem. Some of the well-established clinical laboratory observations, from F. Mora and C.S. Babel, for example, give strong hints as to the physiological problem. For example, low albumin, high prealbumin, low magnesium, and high calcium all suggest hypothyroidism. Problems with the bowel, liver, and sex hormones are highly associated with hypothyroidism, both as causes and as effects. Water retention was so clearly involved in seizures that increased water intake was used as a diagnostic procedure. And then we have the name R. Grinker. Unfortunately, animal experiments showed that water intoxication increased susceptibility to seizures, even in normal individuals. Low sodium content in the body fluids also predisposed to seizures, so that someone with hyponatremia or low blood sodium would be more susceptible to induction of a seizure by excessive water intake. Excessive water uptake is still recognized as a factor in seizures, but now it is seen as a part of a complex process involving energy, hormones, and transmitter substances. And that's from Kemsky Chan. Hypothyroid people tend to lose sodium easily, and unopposed estrogen increases water retention without an equivalent sodium retention. So low thyroid, high estrogen people have two of the conditions, edema and hyponatremia, known to predispose to seizures. Another outstanding feature of seizures of various sorts is that they are most likely to occur at night, especially in the early pre-dawn hours. Low blood sugar and high adrenaline predominate during those hours. Hypoglycemia in itself, like oxygen deprivation, is enough to cause convulsions. Progesterone and thyroid promote normal energy production, and their deficiency causes a tendency toward hypoglycemia, edema, and instability of nerves. 20 years ago, a woman who was considered demented visited me from the age of 21. She had been increasingly disabled by premenstrual migraines. When she was 35, she was a school teacher, and during the summer, a neurologist told her that Dilantin would help her headaches because, quote, migraine is similar to epilepsy, end quote. Although she told the neurologist that the drug made her, quote-unquote, too stupid to teach school, he offered her no alternatives and didn't mention that sudden withdrawal from the drug could trigger a seizure. When classes started, she discontinued the Dilantin and had a seizure. The neurologist said the seizure proved that migraines were a form of epilepsy. At the age of 52, she spent about 20 hours a day in bed and couldn't go outside by herself because she would get lost. After using a little progesterone for a few days, she stopped having seizures, discontinued her drugs, and was able to work. When she returned to graduate school, she got straight A's and earned her master's degree in gerontology. But she had lost 17 years because the drug industry had covered up the role of the hormones in epilepsy, migraine, and the perimenstrual syndrome. The most popular anticonvulsant drugs are both neurotoxic and teratogenic. That is, they damage the patient's brain and greatly increase the incidence of birth defects. The Nazis justified their horrible medical experiments as quote-unquote science, but the effects of epilepsy medicine in the last half-century have been similar in effect, grander in scale, and without any scientific justification. Besides the specific promotional efforts of the drug industry and their branch of government, there is a broader situation that makes their work easier. It is a culture of goony ideas that ultimately emanates from the academic elite, which, since Descartes and before, places quote-unquote thought above evidence. In biology, quote-unquote genes and quote-unquote membranes are confused ideas that are used to justify actions that aren't based on evidence. For the Nazis, quote-unquote cultural degeneracy was a medical, biological, political category based on that style of thinking. In the United States, quote-unquote genes for epilepsy, hyperactivity, language development, IQ, eclampsia, etc. are quote-unquote found at Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Yale, University of California, etc. by an elite whose wits have been dulled by environmental deprivation, that is, by lack of criticism. By manipulating the diet and environment, animals can be made more or less seizure-prone, and it happens that the changes that affect the brain affect all other organs, in ways that are now fairly well understood. Examining the cellular events associated with a seizure is useful for therapy and prevention of seizures, but the same methods are helpful for many other conditions. It is now clearly established that stress can cause brain damage, as well as other diseases. Now that our public health establishment has eliminated smoking from public places, maybe they can find a way to reduce stress and disease by removing morons from positions of power. Goodness gracious. Dr. Peat was really feeling something when he was writing this. I think that's about the third one he's pulled there. Excitotoxicity, in its simplest sense, is the harmful cellular effect, death or injury, caused by an excitatory transmitter such as glutamate or aspartate, acting on a cell whose energetic reserves aren't adequate to sustain the level of activity provoked by the transmitter. Once an excitotoxic state exists, the consequences of cell exhaustion can increase the likelihood that the condition will spread to other cells, since any excitation can trigger a complex of other excitatory processes. As calcium enters cells, potassium leaves, and enzymes are activated, producing free fatty acids, linoleic and arachidonic for example, and prostaglandins, which activate other processes, including lipid peroxidation and free radical production. Protein kinase C, promoted by unsaturated fats and estrogen, facilitates the release of excitatory amino acids, CJW Phyllis and MH O'Regan. And the title of that article is Mechanisms of Glutamate and Aspartate Release in the Ischemic Rat Cerebral cortex. And there's the reference. Estrogen supports acetylcholine release, which leads to increased extracellular potassium and excitatory amino acids. See R.B. Gibbs et al., quote, effects of estrogen on potassium-stimulated acetylcholine release in the hippocampus and overlying cortex of adult rats. And that's where you can find it. And you'll notice several things in there, including, estrogen supporting acetylcholine release. Well, there's a lot of drugs that they're giving to people to increase acetylcholine, when in reality, the studies show that increased cholinesterase, which is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, increases acetylcholine turnover. When you have more of that, you have less of these brain degenerative diseases. Estrogen also stimulates the production of free radicals. Calcium, free radicals, and unsaturated free fatty acids impair energy production, decreasing the ability to regulate potassium and calcium. The increased estrogen associated with seizures is associated with reduced serum calcium. And that's from Giacono and Robertson, 1987. Feedback self-stimulation of free radicals, free fatty acids, and prostaglandins create a bias toward increased excitation. Ammonia is produced by stimulated nerves, and normally its elimination helps to eliminate and control the excitotoxic amino acids glutamate and aspartate. The production of urea consumes aspartic acid, converting it to fumaric acid, but this requires carbon dioxide produced by normal mitochondrial function. Okay, so what does that all mean? Normal mitochondrial function is our metabolism, Oxidative phosphorylation. This is how we want to be creating energy in our body, but due to many reasons, people will not be creating energy by this way, and so they're not creating the carbon dioxide needed for this. So again, this is one of the basic things that Dr. Peat talks about, and he has so many articles on carbon dioxide specifically, but carbon dioxide is not just this thing, this byproduct that we excrete out, we breathe out, and it warms the environment, Carbon dioxide is not this trash product that we need to get rid of out of our body. When we are creating energy the correct way via oxidative phosphorylation, we create more carbon dioxide, and this is a part of a healthy organism. And we're seeing several of the ways here. A deficiency of carbon dioxide would reduce the delivery of oxygen to the brain by constricting blood vessels and changing hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, limiting carbon dioxide production. You can see how it's a bit circular, Self-amplifying. And the failure to consume aspartate in urea synthesis and glutamate as alpha-ketoglutarate and aspartate as oxaloacetate in the Krebs cycle means that as energy becomes deficient, excitation tends to be promoted. This helps to explain the fact that seizures can be induced by hypoxia. Balloonists and mountain climbers at extremely high elevations have mentioned suffering from severe insomnia. The mechanisms of excitotoxicity are probably involved in other forms of insomnia, too. Antioxidants help to control seizures by reducing the excitatory contribution of free radicals and lipid peroxidation. Since excitation can promote the toxic forms of oxidation, many surprising substances turn out to have an antioxidant function. Magnesium, sodium, balancing calcium and potassium, thyroid and progesterone, increasing energy production, and in some situations, carbon dioxide. Aspirin by inhibiting prostaglandin synthesis, and maybe other mechanisms, often lowers free radical production. Adenosine seems to have a variety of antioxidant functions, and one mechanism seems to be its function as an anti-excitatory transmitter. One of estrogen's excitant actions on the brain probably involves its antagonism to adenosine. And that's Phyllis and O'Regan, 1988. Albumin, besides maintaining blood volume and preventing edema, serves to protect respiration by binding free fatty acids. Estrogen blocks the liver's ability to produce albumin and increases the level of circulating free fatty acids. Free fatty acids cause brain edema. This is probably another aspect of estrogen's contribution to seizure susceptibility. Magnesium sulfate has been used for generations in India to treat eclampsia and quote-unquote toxemia of pregnancy, and its effectiveness is gradually coming to be recognized in the U.S. Increasingly, magnesium deficiency is recognized as a factor that increases susceptibility to seizures. Valenzuela and Renardo, 1995, and Slandley et al., 1995. Hypothyroidism reduces the ability of cells to retain magnesium. Thyroid does many things to protect against seizures. It keeps estrogen and adrenal hormones low and increases production of progesterone and pregnenolone. It facilitates retention of magnesium and of sodium and prevents edema in a variety of ways. Progesterone, because of its normal anesthetic function which prevents the pain of childbirth when its level is adequate, directly quiets nerves and in this way suppresses many of the excitotoxic processes. It has direct effects on mitochondria, promoting energy production, and it facilitates thyroid hormone functions in various ways. It promotes the elimination of estrogen from tissues and is a quote-unquote diuretic in several benign ways that are compatible with maintenance of blood volume. It antagonizes the mineral corticoids and the glucocorticoids, both of which promote seizures. That's from Roberts and Keith, 1995. The combination of hypoglycemia with elevation of cortisone probably accounts for the nocturnal incidence of seizures. If progesterone's anti-epileptic effectiveness were not enough, and it is very effective even in irrational pharmaceutical formulations, the fact that it reduces birth defects and promotes brain development and nerve repair should assure its general use in women with a history of seizures, until it is established that they are no longer quote-unquote epileptic. Although thyroid, progesterone, and a high-quality protein diet will generally correct the epilepsy problem, it is important to mention that the involvement of unsaturated fats and free radicals in seizure physiology implies that we should minimize our consumption of the unsaturated fats. Even years after eliminating them from the diet, their release from tissue storage can prolong the problem, and during that time the use of vitamin E is likely to reduce the intensity and frequency of seizures. Coconut oil lowers the requirement for vitamin E and reduces the toxicity of the unsaturated fats. See Cleland et al. Favoring effective respiration and improving thyroid and progesterone production. Endotoxin formed in the bowel can block respiration and cause hormone imbalances, contributing to instability of the nerves. So it is helpful to optimize bowel flora, for example with a carrot salad. A dressing of vinegar, coconut oil, and olive oil, carried into the intestine by the carrot fiber, suppresses bacterial growth while stimulating healing of the wall of the intestine. The carrot salad improves the ratio of progesterone to estrogen and cortisol, and so is as appropriate for epilepsy as for premenstrual syndrome, insomnia, or arthritis. And then lastly, we have some notes here. When the brain loses its oxygen supply, consciousness is lost immediately. And so there is an asterisk at the very top of this article. And we can go back up to see what it says, but it was something about the brain losing its function immediately, right? So, let me start this part again. When the brain loses its oxygen supply, consciousness is lost immediately, before there is much decrease in the ATP concentration. This has led to the proposal of interesting quote-unquote electronic ideas of consciousness. But there is another way of viewing this. While ATP constitutes a kind of reservoir of cellular energy, the flow of carbon dioxide through the brain cell is almost the mirror image of the flow of oxygen. Oxygen scarcity leads directly to carbon dioxide scarcity. The quote-unquote sensitive state, consciousness, might require the presence of carbon dioxide as well as ATP to sustain a cooperative, semi-stable state of the cytoplasmic proteins. The ability of ordinary light to trigger a conformation change in the hemoglobin carbon monoxide carbon dioxide system shows how sensitive a system with only a few elements can be. At the other extreme from consciousness, there is the evidence that carbon dioxide is essential for even the growing/living state of protozoa, algae, and bacteria. And that's from O. Ron, 1941. And so we have it here, his study or article or whatever it is. Quote, protozoa need carbon dioxide for growth, end quote. And on page 113 of this volume, the statement of Valley and Retker that all bacteria need carbon dioxide for growth had been shown to apply to young as well as old cells. And another quote, it is possible to remove it as rapidly as it is produced, and under these circumstances, bacteria cannot multiply. And so when it refers to it, it's talking about carbon dioxide, right? So if you remove it as rapidly as it is produced, bacteria can't multiply. So cannot grow. Okay, and here we are at the very bottom. References for everything you read there. He pretty much hit everything in that, talking about endotoxin and thyroid, progesterone, PUFA, and vitamin E and how it can protect us from PUFA as well as coconut oil. He also hit on the excitatory amino acids. So quite a bit packed into this little article. I hope that's helpful. I was just talking to someone about them having a loved one with some type of quote-unquote epilepsy in the hospital, and so realized I hadn't read this article on here and wanted to read it for you all because I'm sure someone could benefit. Anyway, until next time, God bless.